Hi, so my name is Francis Ailey. I've worked with a Taoist master for 10 years, many years ago, and I've been practicing several Taoist arts ever since. In Taoism, the philosophy and the medical system, there are four bodies. Those four bodies are your physical body. Everybody would recognize that. But there are three other bodies which are equally important to health and well-being and to the overall happiness of each individual. The second body is your emotional body, which surrounds your physical body. The third body is the mental body, which surrounds both of those. And then surrounding all of them, you have a spiritual body. The three first, the physical, the emotional, and the mental, are known as the lower vehicles. And your spiritual body is what actually connects you with everything else in the universe, everything else that exists. These are ancient Taoist teachings, and I've been practicing them now for over 40 years, over 45 years, and I found them immensely useful and helpful. The Taoist philosophy is about acknowledging the reality and the importance of each of those physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies, and integrating and balancing each one, and then bringing all those four bodies into alignment in order to be able to embody your higher consciousness, your consciousness of your soul and your spirit and your monad. So those higher states of consciousness, from a Taoist perspective, they're not easy to reach or embody until you've got a functional personality vehicle. And those four bodies together constitute the personality. And that's kind of what most people recognize.
Interesting. And I'm Cheryl, and I've been working with Francis. I'm one of his clients, and he's been helping me out with integrating the four bodies. And I had some questions that I wanted to ask and to share with you all as well, so that more people can understand and incorporate this information to live more effectively. So one of the questions that I had is, why is it important to be aware of the four bodies? And also a follow-up question to that, why is it not really talked about in Western psychology?
Okay, well, if you want health, happiness, and well-being, and you want the success that the ancient Taoists used to enjoy, I mean, the ancient Taoists were renowned for two things. Firstly, being incredibly fit and healthy and strong. And secondly, being very well-natured, just being happy and fulfilled and satisfied and living meaningful lives. So if you want both those things and all the goodies that go with them, then you need to be aware that your well-being and your health is not just about your physical body. In the West, people focus on the physical body, and to a lesser extent, they focus on the mental body, but they pretty much ignore the emotional body and the spiritual body. That's a big mistake, because if you don't have an integrated, balanced, and functional emotional body, and the same for the spiritual body, you're not going to be healthy, happy, and you're certainly probably not going to live a life that's meaningful and deep and satisfying.
And I
So
think
from
sorry.
So from a Taoist point of view, it's essential to acknowledge the existence of each one of those bodies and to deal with whatever problems arise. I mean, if you have problems on an emotional level, that could seep down into your physical body and cause physical problems. And that's completely that doesn't even exist in Western medicine.
Interesting. Yeah, because you were saying that the emotional body is actually very tied to the health and well-being of the physical body. And if people neglect their emotional bodies, then eventually it manifests in the physical body. So I think one of the things you were mentioning is that the care and maintenance of your physical body, along with the care and maintenance of your emotional body, really determines your state of health and well-being, or a huge percentage of it. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that there's the care of the physical body, but in order for you to live happy and disease free, usually disease manifests on the mental and emotional states first before it manifests in the physical body. And so even if you take a lot of care of the physical body, if your emotional body is constricted or messed up, or there's some issues that need to be addressed, then eventually those are going to come to fruition and manifest on the physical plane. And so it's really important to sort of head them off on the emotional body and just kind of deal with it in a way that is, going to be productive and lead to long-term health.
Absolutely, definitely.
Cool. Now, I have a question about sort of how the science of this all works, because as you mentioned, these concepts are not really well illustrated in modern Western medicine. Um, and in Taoist philosophy, they're very well documented and they're kind of accepted as being true. And, people have this knowledge and this wisdom, and they actually, practically implement it in certain philosophies. So, is there any science in Western medicine that actually does back up what you're saying about the importance of the emotional body and as it relates to physical health?
There is, but you have to search quite far and wide to find it. The scientists are focused on the material plane, so they basically work with the physical body, and that's all they see and know about. In psychotherapy and psychology, it's acknowledged that the mind does have some possible small effect on your physical well-being, but it's not really proven or demonstrated. But
Mhm.
for the ancient Taoists, these things were real, absolutely real. And they understood that if you have a negative state of consciousness in your mental body for an extended period of time, that negative energy is going to seep down into your emotional body, and then it's going to manifest somehow in your physical body. And when
Mm.
I was training with my master, I saw that over and over and over again. He would demonstrate how that was quite literally true and show people the state of their emotional bodies and their mental bodies, and sometimes their spiritual bodies too.
Mm.
And all imbalances, because a disease or an illness for a Taoist is an imbalance of energy of some kind on one of those levels. Um, and if you don't know what level the imbalance is at, then you don't know what the cause of the disease is. And so for Taoists, the key thing is to find at what level is the main imbalance on, and then fix that. So the
Interesting.
Taoists don't treat symptoms as much as they go for the source, the core issue, what's causing, the illness. So they try and find the imbalance and then deal with that. And once you fix the primary imbalance, everything else will fall into place and your health will return.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because I think that there's this sort of materialist dogma that everything
Yeah,
has to happen materially, and that's really the only level of reality that there is. Whereas, as you were just saying with the Taoists, they really want to know what the root cause of an issue is and trace it back to its root. And that could be on the physical plane, but it could also be on the emotional body or the mental body or spiritual body, right? So understanding the causes of things and how they produce certain effects was, I guess, of prime importance, and why they're so effective at curing diseases.
definitely. And just like Carl Jung talked about, that each human being in each culture, in fact, has strong and weak functions. Carl Jung talked about the four functions of sensation, which is the physical, and feeling, and thinking, and spirit. He called it intuition. Um, and tracing the well-being of all those bodies is crucial. If one of those bodies, either in an individual or a culture, is strong or weak, it's going to have an overall impact. And in our culture, in the West, in our modern day culture, scientific computers, etc., it's very materialistic, as you said earlier. But the weakest body is the emotional body from an ancient Taoist perspective.
Hmm.
And so there are many illnesses and complaints and diseases and imbalances on the emotional body, which cause imbalances physically and illness and disease that are simply not acknowledged and that Western medicine simply doesn't deal with. It's not even on their radar.
Hmm.
And yet for the Taoists, emotional well-being is central. It actually is for the Buddhists too, in a different kind of way.
Hmm.
But the Taoists specialized in the medical aspects of this, and they looked into in what ways people are imbalanced emotionally and what kinds of diseases those imbalances cause. And so they used to have a great deal of knowledge about uh, this particular area. And
Hmm.
one of the reasons they were so successful in terms of the legacy they've left behind is they discovered and cultivated ways to create emotional stability, harmony, and peace and inner tranquility. And they succeeded beyond our wildest dreams.
Hmm.
And when I look around me, I see so many people are emotionally in two states of consciousness emotionally. They're full of fear, so they're afraid of all kinds of things, and B, they're under tremendous stress. And both these things, from a Taoist perspective, are illnesses. They're diseases. So stress is a disease and an illness and an imbalance. And fear, if you stay in a state of fear for a prolonged period of time, that is regarded as an imbalance and a disease.
Interesting. Yeah, and how might that manifest too? Because I've heard that, for instance, like there's all types of negative emotions like resentment and anger, and you just mentioned fear and stress being maybe two of the most detrimental ones. How might those manifest on the physical plane as disease?
Well, now we're into traditional Chinese medicine. I'm not a
Okay.
practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, but what I know and that I learned from my Taoist master, um, and he was a Taoist uh, doctor and Chinese medicine. Um,
Cool.
he said that different emotions are tied to different organs and different meridians throughout the body. And so if you have one particular kind of emotion that's very strong and very negative, and it's ongoing, it will gradually deplete and weaken that organ. And then you'll start having complications arising from that. And I've certainly found that to be true. I mean, for myself and for many of my clients, um, many of my clients who turned up in my early days, like when I first got into psychotherapy, would arrive with physical symptoms. And I would say, I'm not a doctor, but what I know is that there is a powerful, potent magic here that if you work with your psychological material in the right kind of way, and you work on the right issues in the right kind of way, then what I've seen is that often people either recover completely or significantly improve physically.
Interesting. Okay,
And
so
I've
you're
seen that
saying
over and over and over again.
Mhm. You're saying that Chinese medicine and Taoist medicine takes this information and it kind of ties it to what someone might be experiencing physically and then addresses, certain herbs or, modalities of healing on the physical plane to sort of address the correct emotional corresponding issues. But what you're saying is that, and what you specialize in, is really understanding where those psychological issues first arise and then dealing with them psychologically first, and then observing how that affects the way that physical improvements might happen. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you go about doing that. Like, how do you identify, for instance, that someone needs to work on their emotional body? Like, what are some key indicators for you, for instance?
Yes. Well, I use astrology and I also use tarot as well as my psychotherapeutic training. So the first thing I would do is would look at someone's birth chart
Mm.
because the birth chart shows the strengths and weaknesses of each one of your four bodies. Uh, for instance, on my birth chart, I have Saturn in Scorpio in the fourth house. Now, Scorpio is a water sign and the fourth house is a water sign. So all my shadow stuff is focused and concentrated in my emotional body.
Mm.
And What that means is that for me, illness is more likely, much more likely to rise from a dysfunctional and emotional body and an imbalance in my emotional body than in any other way.
Hmm.
And as a result, after training with my Taoist master for 10 years and learning how to cultivate a balanced, integrated, functional emotional body, which is what I did, I've noticed that I don't have any physical complaints. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I had all kinds of minor things related, physical complaints related to my dysfunctional emotional body, which I didn't realize at the time. And since I've been working with Taoism and the Taoist tools and exercises and the whole philosophy, I haven't suffered any of those emotional complaints whatsoever, and nor the physical complaints that are associated with them.
Interesting.
So we're
So,
talking about the Taoist approach is completely different. It's like they look at what is your long-term health. So they don't go for quick fixes. That's the antithesis of the Taoist philosophy. What they're
mm,
looking for is long-term, ongoing health and cultivating that and developing that in slow motion, if you like, slowly,
mm,
but very deeply, at a
mm,
very deep level. So I can speak from personal
interesting.
experience that my emotional body, I've completely transformed my emotional body from something that was very, very mangled, beaten up, um, and I was full of fear and self-loathing, and I had all kinds of problems relating to other people. I lacked confidence. I mean, I'm talking about my late teens, early 20s. And once I started doing the Taoist practices, those all just gradually, gently disappeared.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is actually, I think, really practical, useful knowledge too for people who may be listening to this too, because it's kind of like, I'm assuming you might recommend, if someone is experiencing physical distress or ailments, maybe the first step might be to sort of take a step back and kind of examine, okay, maybe do I have anything happening on the emotional level that may be causing these problems? And instead of going after a quick fix, like some sort of prescription or whatnot, really trying to just take a step back and sort of reflect on, how might my emotional state of being be causing this problem? Is that something that you would recommend, or do you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. In fact, Western medicine, as far as I can see, it doesn't treat causes at all. I mean, this again, from an ancient Taoist perspective, it simply tries to, it doesn't even try to cure the symptoms because it never
Mm,
gets to the cause. It just tries to make the person a little more comfortable in their
yeah,
disease. And that's
right.
basically all it does. Whereas the Taoist approach is, if you're sick on any one of those levels, then you need to address that imbalance, find out what energies are imbalanced, and find a way to bring them into harmony. So yeah, it's the difference between just simply doing quick fixes or attempting quick fixes of symptoms, and you're only dealing with symptoms, compared with going to the cause of the manifesting illness. Completely
Interesting.
different approach and philosophy.
Hmm. Cool. Um, can you talk a little bit about how the emotional body affects someone's mental health? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how stress is probably one of the most detrimental factors to a person's physical health, because um, it's really tied into how their emotional body is functioning. But can you also talk a little bit about how that relates to a person's mental health?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, each one of these bodies has a feedback loop within itself, but it also affects all the other bodies too. So if you're emotionally in a state of fear for long periods of time, it's going to have a negative impact on some part of your physical body, but it's also going to bleed upwards to the mental body, and
Mm,
it's going to induce negative fear uh, filled states of consciousness, and the person is going to start having negative thoughts,
mm,
compulsive negative thoughts, and then they're not going to be able to get rid of those or deal with them. And
mm,
then that can become a habit. And once it's a habit, it's entrenched in the psyche. And
Mm.
then that becomes a negative feedback loop of sending negative thoughts to the emotional body and reinforcing whatever fears the person has in their emotional body. And then you get this negative feedback loop between bodies, which can be very destructive. And once it's got that far, it can be quite difficult to break. It can be broken,
Mm.
but it takes an act of will and determination and focus. What I
Interesting.
teach people to do is to reach up to higher levels. There's an old esoteric teaching, and now we're into Western esoteric studies, which are very close to some of the Taoist stuff. And this ancient teaching says that if you have an imbalance on the physical body, go to the emotional body and look for what's causing it there and deal with it from that level. Don't deal with it on the same level. So if you have a physical
Oh.
complaint, you don't try and fix it physically. You go to the next level up. And if you have an emotional imbalance, you go to the next body up, which is the mental body. And if you have a mental imbalance, then you go to your spiritual body and your soul and your spirit. And you look for the balance and the healing from the higher level. And I've practiced this for many, many years now, and I found it to be really powerful, very,
Hmm.
very powerful and potent. And this is one of the drawbacks of Western medicine. If they have, if a doctor has a patient who has a physical complaint, he's only looking at the physical body. He's not using this ancient wisdom and knowledge and power about going to the next body up. But I
Hmm.
found that, whatever body the main imbalance is on, if you go to the next one up, um, it's very powerful. It's very potent. I've seen people experience miraculous healings, quite literally miraculous healings. I've got several. I've got too many stories I could tell
Hmm.
about people being in a terrible physical state, and then they've worked with me, and then I show them how to go up to the next level above the physical and the emotional and mental, and reach their soul. And once you connect with your soul and your spirit, the potential for healing is unlimited,
Hmm.
absolutely unlimited. So if someone is very physically ill and very emotionally imbalanced and tortured mentally, they need to reach their soul level consciousness and
Hmm.
then access that. And everyone can do this. This is a basic human right. I've never encountered anyone who was denied access to that. It seems to be built into not only our psyche, but our physiology and our emotional body and mental body.
Hmm.
And there is great
Fascinating.
power, healing power, and great power of all kinds on the soul level. So, what I've done many times with clients is teach them how to access their soul consciousness.
Hmm.
And ultimately, that's what the old Taoists were doing. I mean, they would not have described it like that, but that's actually what they were doing.
Hmm. How do you think they would have described it?
Oh, they were very, very pragmatic people.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they had their feet on the ground, unlike a lot of spiritual people today that I've met and encountered. And so they would simply talk about, eating brown rice, short grain, organic brown rice, not eating colorings, flavorings,
Hmm.
additives, preservatives, or anything artificial in your food, not eating GM altered food. I
Hmm.
mean, they'd simply talk about it in practical physical terms because the Taoist approach is you will start with the physical body
Right. Right.
and then work your way back up.
Okay.
Um, so they wouldn't have described it just as I've described it. They wouldn't have said, "Oh yeah, you're
Oh,
connecting with your
interesting.
higher consciousness and your soul and so on." But that's actually what they were doing.
Huh. So now when you were talking about how you can sort of go one level up to deal with the problems on another level, is that what philosophy are you drawing from there? That's not Taoist philosophy. Is that Western?
Actually, it is Taoist
It is. Okay.
philosophy. It's part of their system. But I first encountered this in Western esotericism. So, as I said, I trained in astrology and tarot. And one of the esoteric principles I learned was that if you have an imbalance on a particular level, to go up to the next level up and heal the imbalance from that level.
Okay. Gotcha. And that's just something that you recommend to your clients as well as a methodology for dealing with any issue that they might have.
Yes, I teach them how to, if they have a physical complaint, to look at the emotional issues psychotherapeutically. And if they have an emotional complaint, to look at the mental body and how they're um, how they could heal that emotional imbalance from the mental body. And if someone is imbalanced on a mental body, then they definitely, absolutely need to go up to the soul level and start accessing some of that tremendous power that we all have, that nobody seems to be using or acknowledging or working with, which is extraordinary, but that's what I see.
Now, you were also mentioning how the emotional body, and this is a completely new concept to me, is the fact that you're saying that the emotional body someone has to care for the emotional body in the same way that they might with the physical body. So you say that there's a couple of things that people can do to go for the care and maintenance of their emotional body. What would you recommend as some of those strategies? Like, how should someone maintain their emotional body on a daily, weekly, and ongoing basis?
Probably the most important thing that I've seen Westerners need to do is to cultivate self-compassion. That's probably the single biggest thing they need to do. And when I was 18 years old, I was taught a Buddhist practice called the Metta Bhavana. And that's what that whole practice is about. It's about cultivating compassion in your emotional body, and then extending that compassion to your own emotional body first, and then gradually outwards, further and further out into the world. But the Buddhists quite rightly say that if you haven't got that core of compassion in the center of your own emotional body, you're going to find it very difficult to extend. In fact, you won't be able to extend authentic, genuine compassion out to other people. So if there's one thing you can do, practice the Metta Bhavana practice, as I teach it anyway, and several other people that I've come across over the years teach it. There are many variations on it. Some of the variations I don't like. Some of them have just been picked up from the Eastern schools and dropped into the West, and they don't work effectively, and they're actually not appropriate. They're not designed for Westerners. They were designed for Easterners. And the Eastern psyche and physical body and emotional body and mental bodies are very different from Westerners. And so you need to look at the person's culture, their background, their ancestral history, and put all that into context.
Interesting. So what Metta Bhavana practice would you recommend for people in, for instance, Western culture generally?
The metta practice, as I was taught it by the Western Buddhist order, by the Venerable Sangharakshita, he's the guy, the English guy who wandered around India for 20, 25 years and then came back and started teaching the Buddhist practices in London. And I like what he did because he modified the metta practice to adapt it to the Western psyche and lifestyle. And he made a few little tweaks and changes, and I like the way that he taught it. So I like the Western Buddhist order approach and practice, and I found that to work very well. I've tried many other styles and different schools of Buddhist practices over the last 40, 45 years. And I always go back to the metta practice and Metta Bhavana practice as taught by the Western Buddhist order.
Cool. Can you outline that briefly? Like, how would someone practice that?
Sure. Well, the practice has 5 stages. And in the first stage, you open your heart up to the universal loving kindness, universal compassion of the universe, which is infinite, absolutely infinite. And my personal experience is there's no illness, there's no disease, there's no trauma, there's no pain or suffering of any human being can be experiencing that loving kindness, because it's powerful and potent and infinite, cannot heal. So it can heal anything, including physical complaints, I have to say. But you have to start with the emotional body. So the first stage is being able to embody that energy in your own emotional body. And for most Westerners, that's actually trippy. I mean, it's not easily done. Many of my clients have sat down and it's like, oh, I'm going to cultivate self-compassion, and they start doing it, and then they're just barraged with all this negative material that comes from their history, their past, their karma, their old family training, and so on. Most people in the West are taught to hate themselves.
Yeah.
Not consciously, not openly, but actually that's the underlying message that they're given. That's certainly the message I was given. And so that first stage is crucial and key. And often I'll tell people just to do the first stage because it takes a while to get used to that. But when you can do that to some degree, the second stage is to extend that loving kindness out to someone that you don't have romantic or sexual feelings to. That's just to keep that separate, out of the way, and extend that loving kindness to someone you really care about and love. The third stage, you extend that loving kindness to a neutral party, someone that you don't like particularly or dislike. It's just someone you interact with from time to time. In the fourth stage, it gets very challenging. You extend it to someone who is openly an enemy. That's how it's described in the East. Someone who is hostile to you, doesn't like you, and maybe is sending you ill will, and what you return is loving kindness. And it's a very potent practice. I've seen people who've been in long-standing feuds with enemies, lifelong enemies, and they've started doing the metta practice and extending loving kindness, and suddenly the other person's bad energy is not being directed at them anymore. I mean, it heals. It takes a while, but it will eventually heal the relationship. And in the fifth stage, you extend it out to everything that is the entire universe. And that's got several stages, sub-stages within it. It's a very powerful, potent practice. And I've seen it completely transform people's lives many, many, many times.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. And I think that is absolutely true. I think in the Western culture, and I think a lot of this also has to do with sort of the underlying religious dogmas that are prevalent in the West too. It's you're really taught to, hate yourself, feel guilt, feel shame, all these things. And just that's kind of like the underlying assumption of how you, how you go, how you live in the world. And so to direct the energy of loving kindness can be really helpful and transformative.
Definitely.
Cool.
The second thing I'd recommend people do with their emotional bodies is to realize that each feeling they experience is actually a process, and that they need to allow themselves to go through the complete process. But that means they need to allow themselves to have the full experience of their feeling. It doesn't mean they act it out, but it means they allow that full experience. What many people do is they're afraid of certain feelings like envy, jealousy, greed, hatred, anger. And so they block and repress and deny those feelings. As you do that, you stop the process, and that feeling gets stuck. And then it gets stuck in your emotional body, and then eventually it'll start creating complications for your mental body and your physical body too. And so a lot of my work as a therapist has been to help people to free those emotional blocks. But that means they have to allow themselves to fully experience their full anger, their full rage. Often it's about incidents that are like way, way, way back in their past. But once they do that, they allow the process to complete. And along with that, allowing those processes to complete, every single emotion, feeling is a process. I teach them how to disidentify from the feeling so that they're not just their feeling. One of the most important Taoist teachings is about, actually, it's about disidentification. They didn't teach it like this, but this is essentially what it is. They would teach you that you have a physical body, but you are not your physical body. And you have an emotional body, but you're not your emotional body. And the same with the mental body. You have a mind, you have a mental body, but that's not who you are. In essence, you're a soul. And these are the 3D world mundane manifestations of a part of your soul consciousness. So being able to step back from those experiences and realize that's not who you are in totality, that's a small part of who you are. And being able to identify with your soul consciousness, your true origin, your true self, is immensely powerful, because then these physical and emotional and mental experiences lose their power to dominate your entire life.
So what you're saying is that emotions are processes.
Yeah.
And if you have an emotion, but you repress or deny it, or you don't acknowledge it, then that's what causes problems, because it's not being processed in your emotional body. It's just sitting there. But if someone is experiencing, for instance, a huge amount of, anger or jealousy or some negative emotion, it's not that they should necessarily act out on that emotion, because that's a way certainly of completing the process and getting it out of their emotional body, is to act out of anger, act out of jealousy or whatnot. But what you're saying is to don't repress or deny the negative emotion that's happening. Acknowledge that it's a process and that it has a way of completing, and just kind of sit with your emotion and observe it, and observe yourself as experiencing the emotion without identifying with it. And that's how to skillfully process negative emotions. Is that kind of what you would say?
Yes, and I'd add to that, there is no such thing as a negative emotion.
Mm.
There are only feelings. Some feelings are pleasant, some feelings are unpleasant. Some people have trouble expressing their anger because they judge it as being a negative emotion, and I shouldn't feel angry.
Hmm.
Well, you do feel angry.
Right.
And
Don't deny it. Yeah.
whether you deny it or
Right.
not is irrelevant. Your
Hmm.
body, your emotional body, your mental body, they're angry. Anger is
Right.
flowing through those vehicles. And your only choice is, are you going to acknowledge it? Yeah, I'm really angry.
Hmm.
And give that expression if it's appropriate and skillful, and allow that process to complete, or are you going to sit on it? And 99% of the time, people in the West judge emotions as being negative,
Hmm.
and then they sit on them and block them and deny them. And then those emotions go dark. They go into your own subconscious, and
Right.
then potentially they might end up becoming part of your shadow. And
Hmm.
then you're terrified of anger. I mean, you're not just like,
Right.
oh, this is an unpleasant feeling of anger. It's like, no, 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 you're terrified of your anger. And then you don't know what to do with it. And
Hmm.
that's a terrible place to be.
Hmm.
Because actually, something like anger is an expression of your life force. It's an expression of your will, your power, your energy.
Hmm.
And by repressing your anger, you're actually suffocating your life force.
Hmm.
And that's
Interesting.
very detrimental to your health in the long run.
So you're saying, instead of like letting emotions go dark or become part of your shadow, what you want to do is you want to actively do the reverse process of that, and that goes into your shadow integration work, is identifying what things might have been repressed, and then sort of bringing light to that, and then dealing with it skillfully.
Definitely. That's the idea. And it works. I
Cool.
mean, what I'm talking about for me is not theoretical. I've been doing
Yeah.
this work for 45 years, and
Yeah.
I've worked with hundreds of people now, and
Wow.
some of them have had really powerful, potent, dark feelings. Um, and as soon as they start opening up to those feelings and giving them expression,
Mm.
um, their whole psyche changes and improves for the better. But the other thing to
Interesting.
recognize and remember about feelings is not all feelings are coming from you.
Mm.
We pick up all kinds of feeling energies from other people's emotional bodies, and also from places. Places have the same emotional bodies and mental bodies as human beings. They don't have any life force flowing through them, but if someone is traumatized in a particular physical place, that emotional trauma will go out into the surroundings, into the walls, into the floor, into the ceiling. And so
Mhm.
if you go and stay in that room where that person was traumatized, maybe murdered, um, you're going to be absorbing those feelings and maybe doing that unconsciously. And so not all feelings are generated by our own emotional bodies. A lot of our feelings are coming from outside. So another skill that's essential is to recognize when you have a feeling. The first thing I do is this my feeling? Is this coming from my emotional body? And if
Mhm.
it is, then it's okay. It's my responsibility to deal with it. But if it isn't, it's not my responsibility. And usually I hand it back to whatever or whomever is generating it. And I've done, when I was in the UK, I used to travel around the country a lot, and I sometimes stay in old hotels and farmhouses and bed and breakfasts. And sometimes the rooms were infused with some dark energy. And so
Yeah.
I'd do a cleansing and I'd sit there for an hour doing the metta practice, extending loving kindness out.
Yeah.
And that would cleanse the room and heal it. And often people they would actually invite me into their house just to spend the night in order for me to do that, because they knew that, their place would be cleansed emotionally. And then I started
Yeah,
teaching people how to do that for themselves. It's like, no, you don't need me to be there. This is how you do it, but you have to do the
right.
metta bhavana practice first.
That's fascinating. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I remember this is kind of tangential, but I remember like when I was living in San Francisco, there was this place where they had like festivals, and it was called the Cow Palace. And it was where like they had like it was like a slaughterhouse for cows, and it was like in operation for probably decades or whatever, and then it was converted into like an event center and like a
Wow.
venues, and they had and it's just like anybody who was like working there for like venues for like events that happens would always like get sick after like working there for like a
Right.
couple weeks, and like you could just feel like the energy of the place was like really dark and
Yeah.
terrible. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's definitely underappreciated. And it's just not understood that, there's these different levels of reality and existence. And yeah, absolutely. Like places can maintain an emotional charge, and it's important to, how to deal with that. So
And
that's
some
very interesting.
places have a positive emotional charge. I mean,
Yeah.
some of the places where people go to pray and worship
Mhm.
have a tremendously positive emotional energy and life force flowing through them. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what would you recommend? Let's say if someone is experiencing negative physical ailments, then you would recommend maybe taking a step back, seeing how it might affect how their emotional body might be affecting their physical health, and then maybe diving into the metta bhavana practice that you recommended. Is that is that something that you'd recommend?
Absolutely.
Great. And what would someone do if they wanted to book an appointment with you for either tarot, astrology, shadow integration, moving forward with integrating their four bodies? Um, how would they go about doing that?
Well, best place is to go to my website, francisailey.com, and click on contact. And then you can fill in a form, and then we can start talking.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for discussing these really important topics. And thank you.
My pleasure.